We think of Viking longships as weapons of war, instruments of terror slicing through the waves, dragon heads on the prow, shields on the gunwales, a belly full of men ready for slaughter and plunder. But for the men inside that belly, the real enemy wasn't always the one waiting on shore with an axe. The real enemy was the one that seeped through the planks, the one that clung to their clothes, the one that never, ever left. The cold, the North Atlantic cold, a cold that could kill you just as dead as any Saxon spear. How do you stay warm on an open boat, hundreds of miles from land, with no fire, no shelter, and no escape? The answer isn't about courage or seamanship. It's about something far more intimate, something profane. It's a story written in sweat, grease, and the shared breath of desperate men. A story of how Vikings turned their own bodies and the bodies of their comrades into furnaces to survive the unforgiving sea. To understand this brutal reality, you have to understand the ship itself. A longship is a masterpiece of flexible design, built to dance with the waves, not fight them. Oak for the keel, the backbone, pine for the planks, lighter, more buoyant. The planks are clinker-built, overlapping and fastened with iron rivets. This allows the hull to twist and flex in a heavy sea, absorbing stress that would shatter a rigid vessel. It's a brilliant piece of engineering, but it's not a comfortable one. There is no cabin, no shelter. The deck is a set of removable boards, covering ballast stones and the cramped personal chests of the crew. These chests, these sea chests, were the only piece of personal space a man had, and they doubled as his rowing bench. When the sea got rough, every man was needed. The off-duty crew became living ballast, shifting their weight from one side to the other to keep the single. Massive woolen sail from capsizing the ship. There was no escape from the spray, the wind, the damp that soaked everything. This wasn't a pleasure cruise. This was survival. If you value documented history that gets into the grit and grime of the past like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. The script you are hearing is researched and factual, drawing from sources like the archaeological analysis of the Gokstad and Oseberg ship burials and experimental voyages in modern replicas like the Sea Stallion from Glendalough. These sources reveal the harsh truths of life at sea that sagas sometimes overlook. Now back to the information. The first line of defense against the cold was, of course, clothing. But this wasn't just any clothing. This was a carefully constructed system of layers, each with a specific purpose. The innermost layer, against the skin, was typically linen. But the real workhorse of the Viking wardrobe was wool. Wool has a remarkable property. It can retain up to 80% of its insulating value even when soaking wet. And on a longship, you were always wet. Viking women spent countless hours spinning and weaving this wool into dense, heavy tunics, trousers, and cloaks. But the real genius lay in how they treated this wool. Before it was even woven, the wool was often scoured in stale urine. The ammonia in the urine would strip some of the natural lanolin from the wool, but not all of it. This remaining lanolin, a greasy substance from the sheep's skin, gave the wool a natural water resistance. It wasn't waterproof, not by a long shot, but it would shed a surprising amount of water before it became saturated. Then there was the outer layer. A thick woolen cloak, or Giverarfelder, was a Viking's most prized possession on a long voyage. These weren't just simple pieces of cloth. They were often pile woven, with tufts of raw wool woven into the fabric, creating a shaggy, fur-like texture that trapped air and shed water even more effectively. Some cloaks might have been treated further, with animal fats or beeswax rubbed into the outer surface to create a more robust, waterproof barrier. Imagine the smell, the rank, animal odor of wet wool, lanolin, and stale sweat, clinging to every man on board. It was the smell of survival. The Vikings also understood the importance of protecting their extremities. Woolen socks, leather shoes packed with insulating moss or animal fur, and leather mittens were essential. Losing fingers or toes to frostbite on a long voyage could be a death sentence, but clothing, no matter how well made, can only do so much against the relentless, damp cold of the North Atlantic. The real secret to staying warm on a longship was far more personal. It was about shared body heat. The Vikings had a piece of equipment that is rarely depicted in movies or popular culture, but was absolutely essential for survival on long voyages, the hudfat. This was, in essence, a large sleeping bag made from sheepskin with the fleece still on, and sometimes lined with softer furs like fox or rabbit. But the most crucial detail of the hudfat is that it was designed for two men, two large, bearded, heavily armed Viking warriors, crawling into a single sleeping bag together, pressing their bodies close to share every last calorie of warmth. This wasn't about comfort. It was about mathematics. The human body is a furnace, constantly generating heat. A single man in a sleeping bag will warm the air around him, but much of that heat is lost to the environment. Two men, in the same confined space, generate twice the heat. But the surface area for that heat to escape is not doubled. The result is a significantly warmer microclimate inside the hud fat. In the dead of night, on the open deck of a longship, with the wind howling and the sea spray freezing on the rigging, this shared warmth was the difference between life and death. It required a level of intimacy and trust between these warriors that we can scarcely imagine today. They would have known each other's smells, the rhythm of each other's breathing, the feel of another man's body pressed against their own. It was a brutal, unsentimental intimacy, born of pure necessity. And where did the energy to fuel these human furnaces come from? From a diet that was relentlessly high in fat and protein. Before a long voyage, Vikings would feast, building up layers of body fat that would serve as both insulation and a slow-burning fuel source. On board the ship, the provisions were all about caloric density. Dried and salted fish, particularly cod and herring, were staples. Smoked and cured meats, like pork and mutton, would have also been packed in barrels. But perhaps the most important food source was something even more basic. Animal fat, lumps of tallow, rendered from sheep or cattle, and blubber from seals or whales, would have been consumed directly. These were pure, unadulterated calories, the most efficient way to fuel the body's internal furnace. They might have been eaten with hard, dry bread, a simple cracker made from barley or rye flour, but the fat was the key. Imagine a warrior, after a long, cold watch at the rudder, gnawing on a piece of salted fish and a lump of cold, greasy tallow. It wasn't pleasant, but it was fuel. Now, you might be asking, what about a fire? Surely they had some way to cook, to generate some external heat. But the archaeological record is starkly clear on this point. On the excavated remains of Viking longships, like the Gokstad ship, there is absolutely no evidence of a permanent hearth or firebox, no stone-lined pit, no collection of fire-cracked rocks. Building an open fire on a wooden ship, a ship that was waterproofed with flammable pine tar, would have been an act of collective suicide. For short voyages along the coast, it's likely that the crew would have simply landed on shore each evening to cook their meals and warm themselves by a fire. But on the open ocean, on a voyage from Norway to Iceland or Greenland, that was not an option. For days, even weeks at a time, the only heat on board a Viking longship was the heat generated by the bodies of the men themselves. This meant that all the food was eaten cold. The salted fish, the cured meat, the hard bread, all consumed without the comfort of a warm meal. The only source of liquid was likely water, stored in wooden barrels, or perhaps weak ale or sour whey. And with no fire, there was no way to melt snow or ice for fresh water. They had to carry everything they needed with them. This lack of fire also meant a constant, pervasive dampness. Nothing ever truly dried. The wool of their clothes, the sheepskin of their hud fat, the wood of the deck beneath them. Everything was saturated with a cold, clammy moisture. This was the reality of a Viking sea voyage. Not the glorious sun-drenched image of popular culture, but a cold, damp, and deeply uncomfortable existence, endured for the promise of plunder or new lands. Let's talk about the logistics of this shared warmth. A typical longship, a skeed, might carry a crew of 60 to 80 men. At any given time, half of the crew would be on watch, rowing or managing the sail. The other half would be off-duty, attempting to rest. This is where the hud fat would come into play. The off-duty men, in their designated pairs, would crawl into their shared sleeping bags, seeking refuge from the cold. But even this rest was not peaceful. They were still on an open boat in the middle of the ocean. The deck was their bed, hard and unyielding. The roar of the wind and the crash of the waves would have been a constant companion, and they were, still. In essence, part of the ship's machinery. If the skipper needed to change tack quickly, or if a sudden squall hit, the off-duty crew would be called upon to act as that living ballast, shifting their weight to keep the ship stable. Their sleep would have been fitful, interrupted, a brief respite from the grueling work and the biting cold. And what about hygiene in such close quarters, with no fresh water for washing and no privacy? How did they manage? The answer is, they didn't, not in any modern sense, for urination. Men would simply relieve themselves over the side of the ship. For defecation, a bucket in the bow, to be emptied overboard, was the most likely solution. The smell on a longship, after several weeks at sea, would have been almost unimaginable to a modern person. The combination of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, vomit from seasickness, the lingering odor of fish and rancid fat, and the ever-present smell of wet wool and tar would have created a thick, pungent atmosphere. But to the Vikings, this was simply the smell of a sea voyage. It was the price of passage. The psychological toll of this existence must also be considered. The constant, unrelenting cold, the lack of a warm meal, the physical intimacy of the hudfat, the sheer, crushing monotony of the open ocean. It would have required a specific kind of mental fortitude to endure. These were men who were accustomed to hardship, but a long sea voyage would have tested the limits of even the most hardened warrior. The bonds forged between men in the hudfat, the shared experience of misery and survival, would have been incredibly strong. They were, quite literally, trusting their lives to each other, relying on the warmth of another man's body to see them through the night. This was a brotherhood forged in the crucible of the cold. If you appreciate this deep dive into the raw realities of the past, consider subscribing. It's the best way to ensure we can keep making content like this. We're committed to digging up the documented facts, no matter how uncomfortable. Now, back to the longship. The construction of the hudfat itself is a testament to Viking resourcefulness. Sheepskin was readily available, and its natural properties were perfectly suited for the task. The fleece, when turned inwards, traps a thick layer of air, which is an excellent insulator. The hide, when treated with fats and oils, becomes water resistant. The construction would have been simple and robust. 2 or 3 large sheepskins, stitched together with strong linen thread, perhaps with a leather flap at the opening to seal out the wind. It was a purely functional object, with no thought given to aesthetics or comfort beyond the basic need for warmth, and it was likely a personal item, something a warrior would acquire and maintain throughout his raiding career. A good hudfat would have been as valuable as a good axe or a sturdy shield. The use of the hudfat also highlights the communal nature of Viking society. The individual was subordinate to the group. A man's personal comfort, his sense of privacy, was secondary to the survival of the crew. The shared sleeping arrangement was a practical solution to a deadly problem, and there would have been no room for sentimentality or squeamishness. It was a simple calculation of heat and energy. 2 bodies are better than 1, and in the brutal calculus of the North Atlantic, that was all that mattered. This reliance on shared body heat also had implications for the design of the longship itself. The open design, while exposing the crew to the elements, also allowed for a large number of men to be packed into a relatively small space. This was crucial for a warship, where manpower was everything. The men, whether rowing, sleeping, or acting as ballast, were an integral part of the ship's system. They were the engine, the rudder, and the furnace. The longship was not just a vessel, it was a self-contained, mobile ecosystem, with the crew at its heart. It is a stark and uncomfortable image, these famed warriors, the terror of Europe, huddled together for warmth like animals in a den, but it is an image that is far closer to the historical reality than the romanticized depictions of popular culture. The Viking Age was not an age of superheroes. It was an age of incredible hardship, overcome by ingenuity, resilience, and a profound understanding of the natural world. The Vikings didn't conquer the cold with fire. They conquered it with wool, with fat, and with the simple, profane, and life-giving warmth of their own bodies. They turned the longship into a floating, human-powered furnace, and in doing so, they changed the course of history. The secret to their success wasn't just in the sharpness of their blades, but in the brutal, ingenious ways they kept the fires burning within. The human body as a furnace. That was the core technology, not the clinker-built hull, not the single square sail, but the 60 or 80 metabolisms burning away in the wet and the dark. Every man a desperate fire, stoked with fat and protein, trying to keep the spark of life from being extinguished by the North Atlantic. But a furnace is only as good as its fuel, and it is only as clean as the system that contains it. The inside of a Viking warrior was a battleground all its own. We have the receipts for this, not from sagas, but from the latrine pits of their settlements. Archaeologists digging in the Viking-era layers of York and Hedeby have analyzed coprolites, fossilized human feces, and what they found tells a story of a diet rich in protein, yes, but also a story of a constant internal war. These men were riddled with parasites, whipworm, roundworm, fish tapeworm. Eggs of these creatures were a constant presence in their guts, a silent tax on every calorie they consumed. Every piece of dried cod, every mouthful of rancid tallow was shared with a host of invisible passengers. On land, this was a chronic condition, a constant drain on a man's energy. At sea, it was something far more dangerous. A gut full of parasites is a compromised system. It is less efficient at absorbing nutrients. It is more prone to dysentery and other digestive ailments. Now, place that compromised system on a longship. The diet is monotonous and punishingly salty, leading to constant dehydration. The only water is what's carried in barrels, growing staler by the day. There's no concept of sanitation. Hands that have been handling greasy ropes, bailing out bilge water thick with filth, are the same hands that bring food to the mouth. The chances of a catastrophic outbreak of dysentery were astronomically high. A man suffering from violent diarrhea and vomiting on an open ship is not just sick. He is a leak in the system. He's losing fluids and calories that he cannot afford to spare. He is no longer an efficient furnace. He is a liability. His body, struggling to fight off its internal invaders, has less energy to generate heat. He becomes a cold spot in the hut fat, a drain on the warmth of the man beside him. There was no sick bay. There were no antibiotics. A severe intestinal infection was a death sentence, pronounced slowly over days of misery in full view of the entire crew. Before a man ever faced the external enemy of the sea, he had to be armored, and this armor was not made of steel, but of hide and hair. We speak of wool, but we must understand the specific animal that produced it. The North European short-tailed sheep, the ancestor of the modern Icelandic sheep. This was not a fluffy, modern merino. This was a hard, primitive beast perfectly adapted to the harsh northern climate. Its fleece was a dual-coat masterpiece of natural engineering. The outer coat, the tog, consisted of long, coarse guard hairs, rich in lanolin, designed to shed water and block wind. The inner coat, the thell, was a dense, soft, incredibly fine layer of wool that trapped air, creating a powerful insulating barrier. The process of turning this fleece into a seaworthy garment was a monumental task, performed almost exclusively by women. The shearing, the cleaning, the separating of the two coats, the endless hours of spinning the raw fiber into yarn using a simple drop spindle, and then the monumental task of weaving that yarn into dense, heavy cloth on a vertical, warp-weighted loom. A single sail for a longship could take 10 woman-years of labor to produce. A cloak, a tunic, a pair of trousers, each represented hundreds of hours of work. This wasn't just clothing. It was a life support system, imbued with the labor of an entire community, designed to be the first line of defense against the killing cold. Their leather, too, was a product of a profane and intimate process. They used methods like brain tanning, a technique that involves working the animal's own brain matter into its hide to soften it. The fats and lecithins in the brain break down the hide's fibers, making it incredibly soft, but not waterproof. To finish it, the hide would be smoked for hours over a smoldering fire, the smoke penetrating the leather and preventing it from stiffening after it gets wet. Imagine the smell of this process, the visceral odor of brains and wood smoke clinging to the finished tunic or shoes. This was the second skin of the Viking warrior, a soft, supple, smoke-infused hide that moved with his body, a constant reminder of the animal it came from and the messy, organic processes that transformed it into armor. This internal weakness from parasites was compounded by the external assault of the cold on the body's tissues. Two conditions would have been a constant threat: frostbite and trench foot. Frostbite is the freezing of body tissue. It's insidious. It begins with a feeling of pins and needles, then numbness. The skin turns white and waxy. The victim might not even realize what's happening until it's too late. Fingers, toes, the tip of the nose, the ears, these are the first to go. On a longship, with hands constantly exposed to the wind and the spray while rowing or managing the rigging, frostbite would have been a daily danger. Leather mittens offered some protection, but once they were soaked through, they became a liability, trapping a layer of icy water against the skin. Trench foot, or immersion foot, is arguably worse. It doesn't require freezing temperatures. It can happen in any cold, wet conditions. The feet, constantly soaked in cold water inside leather shoes, cannot dry. The skin begins to break down. Circulation is restricted. The foot becomes numb, then turns red, then blue. The flesh begins to die, leading to blisters, open sores, and gangrene. The smell of rotting flesh would have been yet another layer in the ship's foul atmosphere. A man with trench foot could not row. He could not stand a watch. He was dead weight, and the Vikings knew it. There are accounts in the sagas of men losing toes, or even whole feet. To the cold on long voyages, it was an accepted risk of the trade. But accepting a risk and enduring the reality are two different things. The pain of thawing frozen tissue is excruciating, a burning, throbbing agony that would have filled the ship with screams. And what of injury? A slip on a wet deck, a fall from the rigging, a misplaced axe blow during a shipboard dispute. These things happened. In the sagas, we read of great warriors shrugging off terrible wounds. The reality was likely far grittier. The Vikings had a rudimentary understanding of medicine, a mix of practical knowledge and superstition. They knew how to bind a wound, how to set a broken bone, but their most famous diagnostic tool for internal injury reveals the bleakness of their situation. It was the onion test. A man with a deep wound to the torso, a suspected gut injury, would be fed a strong onion or leek broth. Then, the other warriors would crowd close and smell the wound. If they could smell the onion from the gash in his belly, they knew his intestinal wall was breached. There was nothing they could do. The wound was mortal. He was left to die of sepsis, a slow, agonizing poisoning from within. Imagine being that man, lying on the cold deck, surrounded by your comrades, knowing that your fate rested on whether they could smell their lunch on your insides. This was the brutal, unsentimental medicine of the longship. Life at sea was governed by a rigid, exhausting rhythm. The day was divided into 6 4-hour watches, or vaktir. The transition was a study in misery. Men, stiff and shivering, would crawl out of their shared hood fat, their bodies' warmth instantly wicked away by the damp air. They would relieve themselves over the side, pull on their still damp cloaks, and take their places. The men coming off watch, their bodies aching and their minds numb with fatigue, would have a brief moment to gnaw on some salted fish before crawling into the clammy, pre-warmed sleeping bag, seeking a few precious hours of fitful sleep before it was their turn again. There was no escape from this cycle. It was as relentless as the waves themselves. During a watch, a man was never idle. If the wind was good, he was at the rigging, managing the heavy woolen sail, or at the steerboard, the side rudder that gave us the word starboard, fighting to keep the ship on course. If the wind died, the oars came out, and rowing was the true engine of the ship. This was not recreational sculling. A Viking oar was a massive lever of pine or ash, sometimes over 20 feet long. The stroke was a full-body explosion of power. A man would plant his feet on the deck, drive with his legs, pivot his entire torso, and pull with his back and arms, putting every ounce of his strength into every single stroke, for 4 hours. This grueling work generated a massive amount of body heat. A man at the oar was a furnace at full blast, burning 4,000, even 5,000 calories a day. His sweat would soak his linen undertunic, and the moment he stopped rowing, that sweat would turn to ice against his skin, a dangerous, chilling embrace. This is why the high-fat diet was not a choice, it was a necessity. The men were literally eating fuel to power the ship, and the ship itself was always demanding attention. It was a living thing, constantly trying to come apart under the stress of the sea. Bailing was a constant task. Water would seep through the planking, collecting in the bilge along with all manner of filth, and it had to be bailed out by hand, bucket by bucket. Seams would work open and had to be re-caulked, a messy job involving forcing animal hair and sticky pine tar into the gaps. The vast woolen sail, the ship's engine, could be torn by a sudden squall. Repairing it at sea, with numb fingers, using a needle made of bone and thread of sinew, was a nightmare of a task. The rigging of hemp or walrus hide rope would stretch and chafe and had to be constantly checked and adjusted. Every man was a sailor, a marine engineer, and a manual laborer. The work never, ever stopped. In the gaps between the work, the watches, and the fitful sleep, there was the crushing boredom, the endless gray monotony of the sea and the sky. How did they keep from going mad? They talked, they told stories. This was an oral culture. The great sagas, the epic poems of gods and heroes, were not read from books, they were performed from memory. In the stern of the ship, huddled together against the wind, a skilled storyteller, a skald, would recount the tales of Thor and Odin, of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, of the great voyages of the ancestors. For a few hours, the men could escape the cold, wet reality of their own lives and inhabit a world of myth and glory. It was a psychological lifeline, a way of reminding themselves that they were part of a story, a lineage of heroes, and that their own suffering had a purpose. And where stories failed, superstition took over. The sea was a place of powerful, unpredictable beings. A Viking ship was a fragile bubble of order in a world of chaos, and it had to be protected by more than just wood and tar. Before a voyage, sacrifices might be made to Njordr, the god of the winds and the sea, or to the fearsome giant Aegir, who could swallow ships whole. Men would carve protective runes on their oars, their sea chests, even their own bodies. An unexpected storm, a strange bird, a pod of whales, all could be interpreted as omens, signs from the gods to be deciphered by the wise. These beliefs were not a comfort. They were a set of rules for survival in a world where humans were not in control. They were a way of giving a name to the vast, terrifying forces that surrounded them, and in naming them, perhaps, to gain some small measure of influence over them. This brings us to the berserkers, These legendary warriors, who fought in a state of ecstatic fury, are often romanticized. But what if their battle trance was not just for fighting? What if it was a survival mechanism, a way of coping with the unbearable stresses of a life at sea? The theory that berserkers used hallucinogenic mushrooms, like Amanita muscaria, is controversial and far from proven. But it is possible that some warriors used substances, or engaged in ritualistic practices, to achieve an altered state of consciousness, a state in which the cold aomawas, the hunger and the fear were temporarily banished, a way to disconnect from the misery of the physical body. Imagine, in the depths of a North Atlantic storm, a warrior beginning a rhythmic, guttural chant, his eyes glazing over, his body starting to tremble, not with cold, but with something else, a self-induced trance, a way of retreating into the fortress of the mind when the fortress of the body was failing. This is speculation, of course, but in a world without physical comfort, without any escape from the harsh reality of their environment, it is not so hard to believe that some would seek refuge in the landscapes of the mind, no matter how they got there. The social dynamics of the Hudfat deserve a closer look. This was not a pairing of friends. It was a practical arrangement, dictated by the skipper. You shared your sleeping bag with the man assigned to you. What if he snored? What if he was sick? What if you simply despised him? None of it mattered. You would crawl into that sheepskin bag, press your body against his, and endure it, because the alternative was freezing to death. This enforced intimacy created a bond that was deeper than friendship. It was a bond of shared survival. You knew the smell of this man, the rhythm of his breathing, the warmth of his skin, better than you knew your own wife's. You were, in a very real sense, keeping each other alive. But this bond could be broken in an instant. If a man died in the night, his partner would wake up to a cold, stiffening corpse beside him. He would have to push the body out of the Hudfat, watch it be unceremoniously dumped into the sea, and then face the next night alone, with half the warmth he had before. The psychological shock of this must have been profound. One moment, you are part of a symbiotic system. The next, you're alone, and dangerously so. Let's consider the navigation. A mistake didn't just mean you were lost. It meant more time in the cold. It meant rations had to be stretched thinner. It meant more nights in the Hudfat, more exposure to the elements, a greater chance that someone would get sick, or that a key piece of rigging would fail. The navigator, the Kent-mand, held the lives of the entire crew in his hands. He used a sun compass, a simple but effective tool that used the shadow of a central gnomon to find north. But what happened on a cloudy day, or in the fog? This is where the legends of the Solarstein, the sunstone, come in. A crystal, like cordierite, that can detect the polarization of sunlight, allowing a navigator to find the sun's position even through thick cloud cover. For a long time, this was thought to be a mere myth, but in 2002, a crystal of Iceland spar was found in the wreck of an Elizabethan ship, sunk in 1592 alongside other navigational tools. It proved that the technology was real. For a Viking crew, huddled in the cold and the fog, the sight of the navigator producing this crystal, this piece of magic that could find the hidden sun, must have been a moment of incredible hope. It was a lifeline, a promise that the ordeal would eventually end. The entire enterprise of a Viking voyage was balanced on a knife's edge. They were pushing the limits of their technology and the limits of human endurance. The ships were brilliant but fragile. The men were tough but mortal. For every successful voyage described in the sagas, there must have been countless others that simply vanished. Ships that were overwhelmed by storms, their crews thrown into the lethally cold water, ships that were crushed by ice, ships that simply sailed off course and were never seen again, their crews slowly starving and freezing to death in the vast, empty expanse of the ocean. The sagas tend to focus on the triumphs, on the successful raids and the discovery of new lands, but the sea remembers the failures. And this brings us to a final, chilling piece of evidence. It comes not from a ship, but from a windswept beach in northern England. In 1979, archaeologists excavating at a site called St. Andrews, Fishergate, in York, uncovered a mass grave. It contained the bodies of over 30 men, all of whom had died violently. They were Vikings. Their bones showed signs of a hard life, of old, healed injuries. But they also showed something else. Many of the skeletons had telltale signs of severe, chronic nutritional stress and disease, lines of arrested growth in the teeth, evidence of scurvy in the bones. These were not warriors in their prime, cut down in a glorious battle. These were men who were already weakened, already suffering, when they met their end. The evidence suggests they were the crew of a beached longship, perhaps caught in a storm, who were too weak from the voyage, too sick and malnourished, to defend themselves against a Saxon fyrd. They were not killed by swords alone. They were killed by the cold, the hunger, and the relentless misery of the sea. Their furnace had finally burned out. The ocean always wins.